June 17, 1944. The rain had already begun before dawn, the thick tropical kind that fell in sheets and made the earth smell like steam rising off a forge. The American perimeter along the ridge on northern Saipan was nothing more than a narrow crescent of mud, coral rock, and sweat-soaked sandbags. Men were huddled behind whatever cover they could find: rifle pits, shattered palms, burned-out shell holes. They had survived the night attack, but barely. The Japanese had come screaming out of the tree line hours earlier, waves of them, the kind that burned through ammunition faster than any quartermaster ever planned for. By sunrise, most of the American companies were down to a handful of clips, some even counting individual rounds in their pockets. Private First Class Dan Avery, 24 years old and known to his squad as Quiet Dan, crouched behind a half-collapsed machine gun position. His M1 Garand lay across his knees, the metal warm from constant firing, the wooden stock slick with rain and sweat. Dan had one full clip left. 1. 8 rounds for whatever came next. And the ridge wasn't quiet anymore. Far below in the jungle thicket, the sound of brush cracking and boots slogging through mud was drifting upward like a warning. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady nerves that had been worn thin since midnight. His helmet was dented from where shrapnel had grazed it hours earlier, and his uniform still smelled faintly of cordite. To his left, a medic was wrapping the arm of a young corporal who kept insisting he was fine, even though he was trembling. To his right, a communications sergeant kept hitting the side of a radio that no longer responded. They had been cut off. Division believed the ridge could hold itself. They didn't know how thin the line had become. The Japanese were regrouping. Everyone could hear it. The jungle murmured with voices, orders, the metallic rattle of bayonets being fixed. Their officers were preparing a daylight push, a final attempt to crash through the ridge and hit the American supply road behind them. If they succeeded, 2 entire battalions would be surrounded. Nearly 190 men were depending on the ridge to hold, and the ridge was depending on men like Dan Avery, men running out of bullets, energy, and time. Dan pushed his palm across his face, letting rainwater wash the grime from his eyes. He looked down at the final clip in his hand. 8 rounds. 8 decisions. 8 chances before he was as good as unarmed. But Dan Avery wasn't panicked. He had been thinking all night, watching how the Japanese responded, how they charged the moment they believed an American rifle had run dry. That moment, the metallic ping of an empty Garand ejecting its clip, was something every Japanese soldier recognized. They had learned it the hard way in earlier battles. The moment you heard that ping, the American rifleman was vulnerable, mid-reload, exposed for a second that could mean survival or death. Dan had studied that sound. He had listened to it every time the men around him fired. He had watched the Japanese surge forward whenever they heard it. And sometime during the darkest hour before dawn, with adrenaline sharpening his thoughts, Dan noticed a small detail. Something the others didn't. The enemy charged so predictably at the sound of the Garand's empty ping that it almost became a command. It wasn't just a signal. It was a lure waiting to be used. A few yards behind him, half buried in mud, he'd seen what he needed: an empty M1 clip and a small broken wrench from a field repair kit. Dan had pocketed both. Now he reached for them. The wrench was heavy enough, just enough weight to mimic the clatter of metal hitting a rock. He closed his fingers around the makeshift noisemaker, feeling the edges press into his palm. This was it, the trick that had formed quietly in his mind. A fake reload sound, thrown just far enough to make the enemy believe a rifle was empty. He tightened his grip on his Garand, glanced down the slope, and listened. The rustling was closer now. A sergeant nearby whispered, "They're coming again." "Christ, we're dry!" Dan didn't answer. Instead, he crawled forward to where a jagged coral boulder overlooked a narrow channel in the jungle. It was a natural funnel, a place the Japanese had used earlier and would use again. He pressed himself against the rock, rainwater trickling down his cheek, and waited. The first figures appeared as dark shapes weaving between the trees, moving low and disciplined. Dan steadied his breathing. There were maybe 15 of them at first, but shadows behind them suggested more. Bayonets flashed in brief glints, rifles hugged close to shoulders. A few officers whispered sharply. The ridge defenders didn't have long. Dan braced his rifle, raised it slightly above the edge of the boulder, and fired one single shot. The Garand kicked against his shoulder, and the crack echoed across the slope. He didn't wait. He flicked the wrench and clip decoy off the rock with a snap of his wrist. It clattered against a stone exactly like an empty M1 clip ejecting and hitting the ground. The Japanese responded instantly. A shout, a surge, feet pounding upward. They thought he was reloading. Dan already had his rifle aimed. He hadn't emptied the clip at all. He had 7 rounds still chambered. The first soldier broke through the brush, eyes wide in shock as Dan squeezed the trigger. The shot punched into his chest. The man collapsed, and another took his place. Dan fired again and again. The funnel magnified the effect. Every man who charged the supposed empty rifle stepped into a kill zone, just wide enough for Dan to hit cleanly. But Dan didn't fire wildly. Each shot was deliberate, controlled. Every squeeze measured as the Garand recoiled hard into his shoulder. His world narrowed to breath, trigger, and the shifting shapes in the jungle. Rain hammered the leaves. Muzzle flashes lit the branches with brief strobe-like bursts. The closest American behind him whispered something like a prayer. When the Japanese finally hesitated, their bodies piling near the center of the funnel, they scrambled back into cover, confused. The rifle shouldn't have still been firing. They had been tricked, but they didn't know how. Dan pulled the empty clip from his Garand, pocketed it, and reloaded with his only remaining full one. He forced himself not to think about how few rounds were left after that. He forced himself to stay inside the rhythm of what he had begun. He waited. The jungle murmured again. More whispers. More shapes gathering. The officers were angry this time, yelling commands Dan couldn't understand but could interpret. Another push. A bigger one. Dan tightened his grip on the decoy. He fired a single shot into the foliage, then flung the metal noisemaker farther down the ridge, letting it strike coral loudly. The Japanese erupted again. A full squad, maybe more than a dozen men, charged up the funnel with bayonets raised. Dan steadied his rifle and fired as fast as he could control it. The recoil hammered his shoulder. Shell casings bounced into the mud near his knee. Every shot landed close, some center mass, some shattering ribs, some punching through helmets. The rain fell harder, making the slope slippery, but the funnel did its work. The Japanese had to come straight toward him. Behind him, the American medic froze in awe. "Avery, what the hell are you doing?" Dan didn't answer. He fired the 7th shot, then the 8th. The ping of the real empty clip rang through the rain like a bell. He slapped the last clip he had into the rifle, hand trembling from adrenaline. He didn't have the decoy anymore. They had run forward so fast he couldn't retrieve it. But one of the Japanese soldiers who fell near the boulder had a metal canteen cup, and Dan grabbed it. It wasn't perfect, but it might be enough to mimic the sound. He tossed it. It hit stone with a sharp metallic knock. Again the enemy surged, and again Dan Avery fired into them. The ridge shook with gunfire and shouts. Mud splattered as rounds hit dirt inches from Dan's elbows. His uniform was soaked through. His heartbeat pounded in his ears louder than the storm. He couldn't think about stopping. He couldn't think about what happened when his ammunition ran dry for real. He could only think of the men behind him, the 190 souls trapped on this ridge, depending on someone, anyone, to keep the Japanese from overrunning the road. Dan fired until he felt the Garand go empty again. He reloaded once more, now pulling loose rounds from pockets, sliding them into the clip with shaking fingers. The trick wasn't over. It couldn't be over. Not yet. For 36 minutes, Dan Avery would hold that funnel alone, alternating between real fire and fake reload pings, turning a simple sound into a weapon more powerful than anyone expected. and by the end of the 36th minute, the jungle floor below him would be littered with more than 40 Japanese soldiers, stopped, delayed, or killed by one man with a dying rifle, a handful of metal scraps, and a trick the enemy had never seen before. But for now, Dan kept firing. The ridge had to hold, and his trick, his impossible improvised reload trick, was only just beginning to show what it could do. The rain eased for the briefest moment, thinning into a soft mist that clung to the ridge like breath on cold glass. Dan Avery didn't feel the change in weather. He was hunched over his rifle, throat raw from breathing hard, arms trembling from the recoil that had pounded into his shoulder again and again. He could no longer tell where sweat ended and rain began. His hands shook as he nudged the last few loose rounds deeper into the clip, pushing until the metal snapped into place. The Garand felt heavier, as though the hours of fighting had aged it, but it was still warm. It still worked. And as long as it worked, he wasn't done. Behind him, the ridge was a tense world of whispers, men speaking softly as if raising voices might attract death. Some were wounded. Some were exhausted beyond words. Others were shaking from the silence between fights, the kind that terrified men more than bullets. Word had spread about Avery. They didn't understand exactly what he was doing, but they understood what mattered. The line was holding because of that one narrow funnel of jungle, and because the quiet man at the boulder refused to let anything slip through it. The medic crawled closer, his face pale. "You can't keep this up, Avery. You're going to blow your shoulder off or get shot." Dan didn't answer. His gaze was fixed downslope where the jungle had grown eerily still. The bodies of the last wave lay in a crooked line along the incline, their uniforms soaking in the rain, their bayonets half buried in mud. Steam rose faintly from the places where hot brass and blood had fallen moments earlier. The eerie quiet was never good. Quiet meant regrouping. Quiet meant they were gathering again. Voices drifted from below, sharper now, more commanding. Japanese officers barking orders, pushing their men forward. They had expected the ridge to break. It hadn't. They had expected the Americans to fall back. They hadn't. Someone up here, someone they couldn't see, was disrupting everything. Dan leaned forward, resting his cheek against the wet rock. Through the veil of mist, he saw movement. More discipline this time. The officers had changed tactics. Instead of rushing the funnel in a single reckless wave, they were spreading out along the hill's base, fanning into a wide crescent. They were trying to flank, trying to find another approach. Dan's breath caught. If they found the northern side path, the whole ridge would collapse. There were wounded men up there, radio operators, ammo runners with nothing left to run. If the enemy broke past the funnel, 190 men would be trapped in a pocket with nowhere to go but down the cliffs on the other side. Dan pressed his fingers into the mud until he felt calm return. The reload trick worked because the enemy wanted it to work. They wanted that vulnerability. But now the enemy was adjusting. That meant he needed to adjust too. He scanned the ground around him. A broken helmet from a fallen Marine. A length of wire. The same abandoned machine gun pit that had collapsed during the night barrage. And scattered everywhere, casing after casing, shining gold against the dark mud. Metal, shapes, noise. That was all Allure ever needed. Dan took the broken helmet. He flipped it, testing the weight. Lighter than a Garand clip, but hollow enough to give a clatter. He tapped it against the rock. The sound echoed just enough, maybe too much. He tapped again, this time softer. Yes, that was closer. If he threw it just right, angled to hit the coral ridge instead of mud, it might mimic metal on stone. He tucked it beside him. Then he waited. Rain began again, steady this time, drumming on leaves and washing small rivers of mud down the slope. Dan watched the Japanese spread further, quiet, coordinated, patient. They were setting up for something big, something organized. No more reckless charges. These were soldiers now moving with caution. A rifle cracked from the far left where a lone American tried to hit a shadow. Then another shot. Then silence. The Japanese didn't fire back. They didn't reveal themselves. Dan's heart thudded. They're waiting for the ridge to show weakness. They're waiting for the reload sound. He steadied his nerve. He whispered to himself, not as prayer, not as comfort, but as clarity. You want the sound? I'll give you the sound. He lifted his rifle, aimed into thick undergrowth, not at a man, but at empty foliage, and fired one shot. The report echoed, leaves burst apart. Then he dropped low, grabbed the helmet, and flung it sideways along the boulder's slope. It struck coral with a sharp metallic crack. Instantly, movement erupted in the mist. A squad burst from concealment on the near right flank, committing too early, exposing their bodies as they sprinted toward the sound. Dan swung the Garand and fired, not rushed shots, but precise ones, timing the recoil, letting instinct and training meld into something almost mechanical. The first soldier dropped. The second tripped over his body. A third attempted to raise his rifle but fell backward as Dan's round struck his shoulder. Behind Dan, an American corporal yelled, "They're shifting! They're trying to hop the ridge!" Dan didn't turn. He stayed in his pocket of calm, body soaked, hands numb, rifle steady. More Japanese moved in the fog, shadows flickering between tree trunks. Dan fired again and again, working the edges of the funnel as if he were trimming branches to protect a campfire. Each shot echoed up the ridge and returned in soft, hollow rolls. Then his rifle pinged. Dan froze, not in fear, but calculation. He had no more full clips, only scattered loose rounds and a will that hadn't frayed yet. He reached for more casings, tapping them together until he felt the weight he wanted. A cluster of 3 pinched in his fingers. It wasn't perfect, but if thrown hard enough, at the right angle, he tossed them. They struck coral. A nearer sound this time. Almost too near. It was enough. 3 Japanese soldiers vaulted over a fallen log, charging straight toward Dan's position. He slammed rounds into the clip manually, thumb burning as the spring bit into his skin. He rammed the half-loaded clip into the rifle, just as the first soldier cleared 10 yards. Dan fired, and the man spun backward. The second leapt over him, faster, screaming, bayonet extended. Dan fired again. The shot hit low, tearing through the man's thigh. He fell with a cry. The third came on, helmet bouncing, face taut with fury. Dan barely managed to readjust his aim before the man reached 5 yards. He fired. The soldier collapsed forward, sliding to a stop just short of Dan's boots. Dan fell back, panting, ears ringing. The medic beside him stared with wide, hollowed eyes. "Avery, you're insane." Dan wiped blood, he didn't know whose, from his cheek. He didn't feel insane. He felt alive, focused, a single piece in a machine that couldn't afford to lose even one cog. But the Japanese were not broken. They regrouped again. This time the voices were louder. Commands barked with urgency, anger, disbelief. Someone down there had realized the pattern. Someone was telling their men, "Don't trust the sound. Don't fall for the lure." Dan cursed under his breath. Then he saw it. A flash of white cloth through the trees. A Japanese officer, waving his men inward, directing them not toward the funnel, but around it, toward the left ridge path. The path that led behind the American line. The path no one had defended because they never expected the Japanese to find it. Avery scrambled up, mud slipping beneath his boots. He grabbed the medic's arm. "Tell the captain, they're trying the left path." The medic nodded and bolted, sliding through mud toward the command foxhole. Dan ran the opposite direction. Every breath hurt. Every step felt heavier than the last. But he didn't stop. He reached the narrow northern route, a cut in the earth where rainwater had carved a shallow depression over years. Ferns lined its walls. It twisted behind the ridge like a forgotten trail, and down that trail, he could hear them. Soft footfalls, disciplined, creeping steadily toward the Americans' exposed rear. Dan dropped to one knee, bracing his rifle. His clip held only 3 rounds. The rest were in his pocket, wet from rain. He forced himself to stay calm. He waited. The first soldier appeared, slipping out of the mist, careful, scanning with a bayonet raised. Dan fired once. The man dropped silently, but the silence worked against him now. The others heard the shot but not the body fall. They didn't know if he had hit or missed. They didn't know where he was exactly. Dan loaded another round into the clip. 2 left. A shape appeared behind a fern. Dan fired. The shot cracked through the ridge and a second body crumpled. 1 round left. He waited for a third silhouette, but none came. The footsteps halted. Whispers passed between them. They were learning, calculating. The trick had bought time, but not enough. Dan exhaled. His rifle was nearly empty. The ridge was exposed. The medic might not reach command in time. And somewhere behind the mist, dozens more Japanese soldiers were preparing to break through and slaughter the wounded lying helpless in trenches. Dan closed his eyes, letting the rain drip down his lashes. The reload trick wouldn't save them here, not alone. But maybe the idea behind it could. He picked up a fallen Japanese rifle, an Arisaka, and tested its weight. Light. Loud. And its report was different enough that the enemy wouldn't expect an American to use it. He dragged it beside him, propped his Garand across his knees, and arranged his ammunition. 1 rifle for deception shots. 1 for kills. 2 directions covered. 2 angles of sound, a confusion pattern that might buy precious minutes. The kind of minutes men survived on. He braced himself. The footsteps resumed. Dan fired the Arisaka into empty foliage to the right, then spun and fired his last Garand round at a shadow creeping up the trail. The soldier fell. The rest panicked, unsure which rifle to believe, unsure how many Americans guarded the path. Dan used their hesitation. He reloaded the Garand with rounds from his pocket, shoving them deep into the clip with trembling thumbs. Every second counted. He was 1 man, 1 rifle, 1 desperate idea born in the pressure of death. But the ridge was still holding, and 190 men still had a chance, because Dan Avery refused to let the enemy pass, refused to let noise and fear and exhaustion define his last moments on this earth. The trick wasn't about sound anymore, it was about will, and Dan Avery still had enough will to fight. The northern path had gone quiet again, but Dan Avery didn't trust the silence anymore. He pressed his back against a soaked tree trunk, Garand across his knees, Arisaka beside him, and listened with every fibre of his being. The ridge was breathing. Men shifting in foxholes, the distant groan of the wounded, the hiss of rain sliding through leaves. But beneath all that familiar noise was something else, something deliberate, something careful. He wiped rain from his eyes, his fingers trembling from the cold and from the endless recoil pounding they had endured. His shoulder felt bruised deep down to the bone. His chest rose and fell in sharp bursts. His hands were numb, his arms heavy, but his focus never wavered. Somewhere down that narrow, mist-choked path, Japanese soldiers were crouched, watching, waiting for the sound that would tell them when the American rifleman had no more fire left to give. Dan checked his ammo again. 3 loose rounds left. That was all. None of the dead around him had M1 ammo. Japanese bullets, yes, but those were useless for the Garand. The Arisaka rifle had a handful of rounds remaining in its magazine, but its bolt was stiff with grit and rainwater. It was a weapon he could only rely on for noise now, not precision. The Americans farther down the ridge didn't know how thin his line was becoming. They didn't know the left path was being held by a man with only 3 shots left, and a technique that had begun as luck and become instinct. But maybe that was enough. Thunder groaned from somewhere beyond the horizon. The sky darkened to a charcoal bruise. Dan tightened his grip on the Garand. The storm would offer cover for both sides. Shadows moved easier. Sound travelled strange and distorted. Risk cut both ways, and today, Dan was willing to gamble everything on that. A twig snapped below. Dan froze. Another step. Then a faint whisper. Japanese. Urgent. Close. He raised the Arisaka slowly, careful not to let the wet bolt scrape. He aimed not for a target, but for a deception shot, angled off a rock formation that would bounce the sound. He took a breath, exhaled to calm the tremble in his chest, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked sharply, echoing in a way the Garand never could. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then several figures rushed through the mist on his right, moving toward the sound. Dan waited. Waited until they broke the half-moon of undergrowth, then fired the Garand at the first clear silhouette. The man fell backward, his momentum cut short. Another man stumbled over him and fell too, shielding the rest from Dan's line of fire. Dan loaded another round into the clip manually, pushing hard until it clicked. 2 rounds left. The Japanese officers shouted something, short, clipped, the kind of command that cut through chaos. The men stopped charging, they dropped low, they began advancing more carefully now, pressing forward in a staggered formation. Dan's trick had bought him a moment, but it wouldn't buy him many more. They had understood now that whoever defended the ridge was unpredictable, firing from multiple directions, manipulating sound in ways they didn't expect. For the first time, Dan felt a flicker of fear. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of failing. He was afraid of hearing Japanese bayonets slice into the wounded men lying helpless behind him. He was afraid of letting the ridge fall. He had seen enough war to know that some positions mattered more than others, not strategically, not tactically, but spiritually. If this line broke, it would shatter the men who survived more deeply than any bullet could. He planted the butt of the Garand against his bruised shoulder and crawled backward several feet to a new firing angle, one that forced the enemy to reveal themselves fully if they advanced. Rain thickened to a curtain. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. That worked in his favor. He fired the Arisaka again, farther left this time. A hollow crack drifted through the trees. The Japanese shifted toward the sound, their formation widening. Dan slipped behind a low rise in the mud, lifted his rifle, and waited until the faintest silhouette appeared. He fired. The figure dropped. 1 round left. Dan sucked in a shaking breath. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the last spent casing, the ones he had used earlier to mimic the ping. A single casing could make a noise if struck right, but it was tiny, nearly weightless, useless against mud, only reliable if he threw it against coral or wood. But he was out in the open now, no boulder to bounce it from. Another whisper drifted up the path, then another, closer. Dan swallowed hard. There was one trick he hadn't used yet. One that wasn't about throwing, one that used the weapon itself. He pulled the bolt of the Arisaka back sharply, letting the empty brass casing clatter onto a nearby stone. The sound was crisp, clear, unmistakable. It wasn't the Garand ping, but it was metal hitting rock. The response was immediate. 3 Japanese soldiers surged through the fog, believing he was switching weapons, reloading, or repositioning. Dan raised the Garand and fired point blank into the first man's chest. The recoil jarred his entire arm. The second soldier charged past the falling body, screaming, bayonet extended. Dan lunged sideways, the blade slicing through his sleeve and grazing his arm. Pain tore up his bicep like hot wire. Dan gritted his teeth, swung the rifle stock hard, and cracked it across the man's jaw, knocking him sideways onto the mud. The third soldier was already mid-leap, feet leaving the ground, bayonet flashing silver in the rain. Dan had no round chambered. Instinct moved faster than thought. He grabbed the fallen soldier's rifle with his left hand and jammed the muzzle upward, deflecting the incoming bayonet. The Japanese soldier landed hard, rolled, and swept his blade toward Dan's legs. Dan kicked mud into the man's eyes, grabbed his Garand, and drove the barrel forward like a club, striking the man's temple. Silence returned in a sudden, jarring wave. Dan stumbled back, breathing so hard his chest burned. His arm throbbed where the blade had cut him, warm blood mixing with cold rain. He looked down at his Garand. The weapon was splattered with mud and blood. The clip was empty. He searched his pockets. Nothing left. No rounds. No casings. No tricks. For the first time since dawn, Dan Avery was completely unarmed. He looked toward the ridge. Toward the men he had protected. Toward the stretch of earth where 190 Americans lay, depending on a thin line of noise and courage to keep them alive. He couldn't fall back. Not yet. Not with the enemy this close. So he did the only thing he could. He picked up a Japanese grenade from a fallen soldier's belt, the pin still intact, and crawled back toward the edge of the path. He pulled a muddy poncho over his back, blending into the hillside, breathing shallowly to stay silent. He positioned the grenade beside him, finger hooked lightly through the pin. Footsteps approached. 5, 6, more. He couldn't see shapes yet. Only shadows. Only movement in the mist. They were coming slowly now, hunting rather than charging. They knew an American was somewhere close. They knew he had kept them at bay for nearly an hour. They knew he was wounded, and they believed he was finally out of ammunition. Dan whispered to himself, "Come closer, closer." A silhouette passed within feet of him, then another, then a third. They were moving past him, up toward the ridge, toward the wounded. He slid the grenade forward, pulled the pin silently with a twist of his wrist, and rolled the device into the center of their cluster. 4 seconds. He held his breath. The explosion ripped through the rain like a thunderbolt, hurling bodies aside, blasting mud into the sky. The shockwave punched into Dan's ribs and left him gasping. But the path was clear, the immediate threat gone. Before the ringing in his ears faded, American voices shouted behind him. "Avery! Avery! Where are you?" Dan tried to call back but only managed a hoarse whisper. Boots splashed through mud and 2 soldiers grabbed him under the arms, lifting him. They dragged him onto the ridge, where the captain crouched low, rain streaking down his face. "You held the entire flank by yourself," the captain said, voice shaking not with fear but disbelief. "The whole 36 minutes. You stopped over 40 men alone. You saved this ridge. You saved all of us." Dan blinked rain from his lashes. Did they break through anywhere else?" "No," the captain said firmly. "Because you stalled the whole attack. Reinforcements got here just in time. The line is secure." Dan leaned back, letting the news wash over him like warmth cutting through cold. For the first time in hours, his muscles loosened, his breath steadied. Men were alive, because of a noise, a trick, an idea born from desperation. All around him, wounded soldiers stared at him with awe. Others gripped his shoulder. One whispered, "You mad bastard. You held them. You actually held them." Dan didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired. He felt bruised. He felt grateful. As medics lifted him onto a stretcher, he looked once more toward the jungle below, now quiet, the mist clearing to reveal the steep path littered with bodies. He didn't revel in it. He didn't celebrate it. He only felt relief that the ridge still belonged to the Americans, that the men behind him could fight another day. As they carried him away, he whispered one final thought, soft, almost lost in the rain. It was just a noise, that's all. Just a sound that saved them. A sound that turned one man into a wall. A sound that kept 190 men alive. A sound that echoed long after the guns fell silent.